Okay, welcome to the lecture for crisis intervention. We're talking about Chapter 8 of Aguilera, Situational Crises. And this chapter examines some situations that may precipitate psychological crises. So not everyone experiencing these situations will necessarily have a crisis, but the risk is certainly increased. So it's helpful to talk about some of these precipitating events. And the chapter and this lecture don't cover all the events, obviously, that could precipitate a crisis, but it covers some of the more common ones that more commonly lead to crisis. The first thing we'll talk about is a pretty broad category of situations. A change in role or status. So important first to define what we're talking about. So your role is basically what people expect you to do. One of my roles is a lecturer. I'm expected to convey information and promote learning in students. Note, I didn't say professor. That's a job title because professor is comprised of multiple roles. So lecturer, researcher, committee member. Probably should put committee member first. So again, role is what people expect you to do, which is different from your status. Status is really about how much power you have relative to others in some social hierarchy. So at the university, I have a boss, and he has a boss, and she has a boss. And I also have some power over students, right, determining grades, letters of recognition. So I'm fit somewhere. I have some status there relative to others. Another way to think about status might be at family gatherings. Right? Status may be related to generation. Right? So who sits at the kids' table. That's kind of an indicator of your status. Who makes the plans for when and where gatherings will take place. That's an indicator of status. People of higher status have more power to make decisions and get the good stuff. Right? So if you experience a change in role or status, you experience a change in what people expect of you, or you experience a change in your power or status, that may precipitate a crisis. So one thing to think about in terms of likelihood of causing a crisis would be whether or not the change was imposed or chosen. And we're probably more likely to experience a crisis if the change is imposed on us than if it were chosen. Doesn't mean the chosen change can't cause crisis. If you choose to become a student, right, that's going to cause a change in your roles, right? Probably an expansion of your roles, because whatever role you had before you were a student, you probably didn't get to give that up. If that was mother, father, employee, whatever, you had some expectations of you based on what you were doing. You probably didn't give that up. You probably just added this other role of student, where now there's some more expectations put on you. So even though you chose that, that may cause a crisis if you don't have sufficient balancing factors, kind of resources, to deal with the increased demand. I'm just noticing a typo is about to come up, so I apologize for that. Another thing to think about is whether it's predictable or unexpected. Not unexpected is 3. You could ignore the number. Obviously, if it's predicted, if it's predictable and something you could foresee, less likely to cause a crisis. Possibly because you can prepare for it. But just because you can predict something doesn't mean you're going to prepare for it. So even predictable crises, or predictable changes, may cause a crisis. Things that may be more predictable, if you have kids, one day they're going to go off to college, right? They're going to move out of the house, and that's going to lead to a change in role for you. And it's going to happen, at least you hope it's going to happen, but it still causes a crisis. For some people, kind of empty nest syndrome, right? But then if you get laid off at work, the company's downsizing, you don't really expect that to happen. Maybe you can see the signs shortly, but you don't go to a job thinking, okay, someday I'm going to get fired. Usually, it's not something you plan for. And those unplanned things tend to be more likely to cause crisis. But even things you can plan might still cause a crisis. Okay, related to this topic, things I want you to be thinking about that I want to talk about in class would be what role changes would you imagine would be most likely to result in crisis? So either losing a role, having to give up a role, or taking on a new role. What kind of roles or role changes you think are most likely to cause a crisis. Similar to that, what contexts for change in status will be most likely to result in crisis? So, kind of think about what hierarchy. So, your status in the family, your status at work, your status in school. So, what kind of context would a status change be most problematic, most likely to cause a crisis for people, for yourself? What do you think? Okay, moving on to other situations. Talk about rape. First I want to talk about some of Aguilera's comments. Aguilera says that rape arouses almost as much fear as the word murder, and I would actually argue that it arouses more fear, at least for me, because things worse than death. For me, rape seems more scary, more traumatic, kind of this crisis-causing event than feared death. But maybe just a personal bias there. But another thing that she says I want to address, she talks about how the rapist dies emotionally because he can no longer express or feel tenderness or love. Well, this is a broad generalization based on her theoretical perspective, psychodynamic approach, that may not apply to all people who commit rape. And it speaks to the tendency to see all rapes and rapists as the same, which is, I think, a misunderstanding of a complex phenomenon. Like thinking that rape is, it's about aggression, it's not about sex. Well, sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's about sex too, right? It's complicated. Research doesn't support kind of a homogeneity among perpetrators regarding their motivations or their experiences afterwards. So, kind of be wary of the kind of broad generalizations that you see here or elsewhere. Okay, so again, we kind of define what we're talking about. Rape is sexual intercourse with another person without that person's consent. And it's important to note that the other person may not be able to give consent, either due to some disability or kind of a permanent disability or temporary inability caused by a chemical. Right? If somebody who's intoxicated has inability to give consent. Now, in the eyes of the law, that's different from sexual assault. Sexual assault is a broader term, really, that doesn't necessarily involve intercourse. So rape has to involve intercourse. But the things we talk about when we talk about rape, we can also probably think of them as applying also to sexual assaults. So beyond, even if somebody's assaulted but they don't necessarily experience intercourse, so that a victim of sexual assault, things we talk about will still apply. It's not psychologically they're not that distinct necessarily, but legally they are. It's important to kind of make that distinction. So we'll talk about kind of common reactions to rape. Your book talks about the rape trauma syndrome, this kind of two-stage reaction. The first stage, the disorganization phase. The acute phase, the immediate reaction, includes some physical reactions, changes in sleep patterns, eating patterns. There may be physical damage from the assault, pain. Emotional reactions, most commonly fear, most common emotion, but also maybe humiliation, shame, self-blame, which is emotional / cognitive, anger may be there. Other kind of cognitive reactions, attempts at thought blocking, so trying not to think about it. And we can know from treating OCD that the more you try not to think about something, the harder it is to not think about it. People will try to do that, try to suppress memory sometimes. And maybe partly because of that, they may also ruminate about the attack and how it might have been prevented. So they may try not to think about it, or they'll think about it all the time, kind of obsessively. And that's kind of the immediate reaction. And then stage 2, sometime after that, so the reorganization phase, that's kind of this long-term process. After the initial impact has been absorbed, how does the person put her or his life back together and make sense of things and go on about living? So everything in the acute phase may still be present, right? So all that stuff, the fear, the anger, may still be there. But if you're in stage 2, it's to a lesser degree. It's not as intense. But especially those cognitions may still be there, especially because our emotions tend to come back to a baseline. But if we have this kind of cognitive track we've gotten on, we can stay on that a long time. There may be significant lifestyle changes, moving to another neighborhood or city, beginning a relationship, ending a relationship. It may involve some withdrawal from the world, like the world's not safe. I'm just going to stay in my apartment and not talk to anybody because I no longer feel safe out there. And that may be a very long-term coping reaction. So some of the things I want you to be thinking about for us to talk about in class, one of them we've talked about before already is a difficulty working with survivors of rape and other sexual assaults is the tendency of the survivor to blame herself or himself for what happened. So the question is, how do you balance challenging the idea that it's their fault without also teaching them that they should be afraid it might happen again? Right? So there's nothing they could do to stop it. Oh, it's not your fault. Nothing you could do. Well, then there's nothing they can do to stop it happening again. Right? So kind of walking the tightrope there. And as you're thinking about how to resolve that, that's kind of a research finding to share with you. Individuals who are higher in self-blame are at increased risk for victimization, for re-victimization. So if somebody blames themselves for being the victim of sexual assault, they're at a higher likelihood of being victimized again than somebody who doesn't blame themselves. Okay. Okay. The next situation to talk about would be physical illnesses. The chapter provides some brief summaries of some different ways that theorists have conceptualized the process of recovering from an illness. I won't go over them again here. Important things to note about illness in crisis would be think about whose crisis is it, and the fact that illness can precipitate a crisis for an ill person, right? So you find out you're sick, that can cause a crisis, but it can also lead to crisis for family members or caregivers, because it frequently leads to changes in roles and status, right, of those other people, and also yourself if you're the sick one. So it can affect more than just the sick person. Keep in mind kind of mind-body dualism that we're learning more and more about as our science of the mind and body progress. In this context, understand that dealing with the psychological challenges of having an illness have an impact on the outcome of the physical healing process. Right? People who deal with the stress of being sick, if you deal with the stress well, your illness is going to have a better course, you have a better prognosis than if you don't deal with kind of the psychological, emotional aspects. Right? So they're tied together. In terms of the emotional component, you may see the people struggling with illness. Fear is the most common underlying emotion. Right? Fear, am I going to get better? If I don't get better, what's going to happen to me, to my family, the things I haven't done? And then the other kind of underlying emotion that is also frequent there would be anger. So anger that this happened to me, or I'm not going to get these things, or that this is happening to my family. And then Aguilera also kind of related to physical illness. She spends more time talking about one particular illness, being Alzheimer's disease, which is an incredibly difficult long-term problem to address. And in terms of crisis intervention, the way that it's going to be different from other illnesses, in addition to the stuff we just talked about, there's some things that may happen related to the disease, getting lost. So again, for this, the psychological crisis, is unfortunately more frequently experienced by caregivers. So if the sick person wanders off, that can lead to a crisis and lead to fear and anxiety about, okay, what if it happens again? Or before you find them, where are they? Are they in a ditch somewhere? crisis people may have to face, depending on what kind of care they set up. But there is a high rate of caregiver fatigue um, among individuals caring for someone with Alzheimer's. And there may be disagreements among caregivers about who will take care of an ill person, right? So if mom gets Alzheimer's and there's 3 kids and the kids like, oh no, it's your responsibility, it's yours, oh, it's mine. That can be that in itself can be a crisis of figuring out who's going to take on this new role, right? So that's also a role change for somebody. Okay, now on to kind of one of the bigger topics for crisis intervention, suicide, right? Which I think, as I've stated before, suicide can be the result or cause of a crisis, right? So suicide risk increases with most of the crises we've talked about it and will talk about, right? So it's one of the things that you need to be prepared to deal with. But it can also be the cause of a crisis among the family members and friends of the person who committed suicide. So first, let's talk about suicide as a result of crisis, and so we want to talk about how do you assess the risk of suicide, the risk that someone's going to make that choice, and then what do you do depending on what you get back from your assessment. Right? So in terms of assessing the risk, first think about your initial symptoms, right? So things that would cue you to do a more thorough risk assessment, which obviously them presenting to you in a crisis situation, that's a risk factor, right? That's an initial thing that's going to heighten your awareness. Okay, I might need to really look at the possibility that they're going to hurt themselves, right? Because people in crisis are more likely to make this choice than somebody not in crisis. The obvious stuff. If they say they're thinking about suicide, that's a risk factor. Depression is a risk factor. It's important to note, though, that sometimes when somebody is experiencing severe depression, it'll lift a bit when someone decides to act on suicide thoughts. It's kind of the thinking being that, oh, they see there's an end of the pain coming soon, and they feel a bit better about it. They don't feel better enough to say, okay, I'm not going to kill myself. The only thing that's making them feel better is the thought that it's going to end soon. I'm gonna do it. So depression is a risk factor, but a slight increase in mood of somebody who's severely depressed is another kind of risk factor, kind of counterintuitive one maybe. But depression plus agitation is especially worrisome, right? Because depression tends to be associated with low energy, right? And it's hard to act on impulses when you just can't do anything. You don't feel like doing anything. Oh, I want to kill myself, but I just can't get around to it. But agitation provides the energy to act, and that's why that combination kind of heightens the risk of suicide. Another thing, a recent stressor, which obviously would be whatever put them in crisis, situation, somebody in crisis, with the most common type of trigger as a stressor being loss. So and most common type of loss is loss of someone, death, but it could also be loss in terms of divorce in a relationship, loss of a job, loss of some opportunity. But loss, as a broad term, is the most common trigger of suicidal action. Other things you want to ask about in kind of initial assessment will be family history of suicide attempts and completions, and you want to ask about both of those things. The individual's own history of previous attempts, and if they attempted, what method or methods did they use? So, and when you're asking about the method, you want to know about, or you want to be thinking about the lethality of the method. Did they use something that should have killed them, but they just got lucky and didn't die? You kind of get some information, not perfect information, but some information about how serious their attempt was. And then you want to know, okay, if they attempted, why are they not dead? So did they get lucky and somebody happened to walk in? Did they take some pills and then call somebody right away? And again, that kind of gives you an idea of the likelihood of them completing suicide again, or if there's somebody who's going to make these gestures, kind of get some information about that. But along that line, something to think about here. People often ask about, well, what about those people who use suicidal threats or gestures manipulatively? Right? Yeah, people do that, and it's frustrating for therapists because it causes a lot of anxiety in the therapist, and then you kind of get mad at the client for doing that. But you've got to manage that anxiety because even if they are doing it manipulatively, they don't have to intend to kill themselves to be successful, right? They could accidentally take too many pills, or cut too deep, or do something and then call somebody and that person's not home, right? So even people who are doing it manipulatively are at a risk, increased risk for being dead. Okay, but so you want to assess these initial symptoms, right? So, okay, what's the risk this person is suicidal, right? And then after that, you want to say, okay, I think they want to kill themselves, they think about killing themselves, they're at a high risk of killing themselves. Are they going to do it soon? What's the imminence of the harm? Are they in imminent danger of hurting themselves? Or are they still in that kind of, well, yeah, I'm probably going to kill myself someday, but not anytime soon. I've got some things to take care of first. So what's your timeline here? Which is going to dictate to some extent what actions you should take. So you need to figure out how likely it is they're going to act on the thoughts in the near future. Things to ask about: do they have a plan? If so, is the method that's included in their plan lethal, or how lethal is? Is it I'm going to take 20 Tylenol? Well, okay, you're going to have a tummy ache, but that's not really going to kill you. Is their plan specific? Right? So the more lethal the plan, the higher the risk. The more specific the plan, the higher the risk. So if they have a time and a place and they know, okay, I'm going to do it here, my parents will be out of town, no one will find me for 2 days, that's a very high risk. If they say, oh, I don't know, sometimes that flashes to my mind, I should just, pull off the road, off a bridge. That's a more kind of vague plan, which is you should still talk about, but it's not as high a risk as I have a gun in the closet, it's loaded, I'm going to go home when my parents are out of town and put the gun in my mouth and pull the trigger. Can they answer the question, why wouldn't you do it? So what reason can you give me that you wouldn't kill yourself? And if they can answer the question, it's best if the reason is something that's fairly stable, like, oh, I want to do it, but I could never do it because I can't leave my kids behind. That's a fairly stable reason, assuming the kids aren't, 17 and about to leave home. They're going to be kids for a while. Versus something that's maybe a little less stable. Oh, I really couldn't do that to my girlfriend. Not wife or husband, but some maybe more temporary relationship, because that relationship could end. And if this person's really severely depressed, there's a high likelihood that relationship's going to end, because people don't typically stay in with somebody who's struggling with these kind of issues. So the risk is higher if it's not a stable reason, and it's also higher if they can't really give a reason. Well, I don't know why I wouldn't do it. There's really nothing stopping me. That's higher risk. Other things to ask: what resources are they currently accessing to help with these feelings and thoughts? Have they told anyone else? Are the people in their life supportive, or are they destructive? Are the people in their life giving them messages like, I'd be better off without you around? If so, again, that's higher risk. Other things to think about in terms of behaviorally, what are they doing? Are they using or abusing substances, narcotics or alcohol or anything? Because people are often ambivalent about suicide. And not ambivalent as, oh, I don't know. Ambivalent about, as in, I really want to do it, but I really don't want to do it. So feeling strongly two things at once. That's what ambivalence is, right? And many substances increase impulsivity, right? If you're increasing your impulsivity, then you're more likely to act when you're feeling one certain way. So when the pendulum of that ambiguity is swinging back and forth with, I really want to do it, I really don't really want to do it, and you're stoned, now you don't have the kind of the patience to think, okay, but I know part of me doesn't. You're impulsive and you just do it. So substance use increases that risk of acting on the suicidal thought. And then the last piece of the assessment, which may be the most important one for me anyway, conceptually, is there hope? You know, might things ever get better? And if there's hope, then the risk is low. If there's no hope and they can't see things getting better, then you've got pretty high risk, and that's a fairly good predictor that they're going to make an attempt. Okay, so talked about assessing the risk. Now, what do you do? Taking action. Well, if the risk of harm is high, hospitalization is the way to go. And as a therapist, you can't, in Texas, you can't hospitalize somebody yourself. You can't commit someone to a hospital. Only a physician or a law enforcement officer can legally detain someone and make them stay in the hospital, you know, for this brief time period, usually 24 hours, and then longer than that, a judge has to get involved, and there's kind of a legal process involved with a civil commitment. But since you can't hospitalize them yourself, you ask them, okay, I think you need to the hospital, I'll go with you, or if not only do that, you say, okay, let's call the police or the sheriff, and we're going to ride to the hospital together, which is probably a better idea than you driving or them driving, because you don't really want to be in the car with somebody who's suicidal. Grab the wheel, or with them driving also seems like a bad idea. So let's let the police drive. We'll sit in the back seat. Go with, excuse me, go with the client to the hospital, if at all possible, to make sure they kind of get worked into the admissions process, and they don't get there and say, oh no, I don't know why they had me come. I'm not suicidal at all. So you can be there and you can kind of give your information. Okay, they told me this. Told me they had a gun in their glove box and it's loaded and blah blah blah. So you can kind of give that information to help the person who's there, which will probably be an MHMR worker who's going to decide whether or not they get admitted. You're also easing their agitation and preserving your therapeutic relationship, because again, you're not done with them after they've been sent off to the hospital. They're going to get out of the hospital and they're going to need to come back and be in therapy. So you want to preserve that therapeutic relationship. And one really powerful way to do that is to go with them through this kind of scary process of getting admitted to a hospital to protect themselves. Right? Because we know people have a really high rate of committing suicide upon release from the hospital. Right? So we're not done with them just because we got them to a hospital. You still have more work to do. So if the risk is high, hospitalization. If the risk is moderate, and there's no hard and fast line here, but if the risk is moderate, so it doesn't merit hospitalization, there's not imminent harm suspected, then you need to develop a prevention plan. And several pieces to this. First and foremost, in my mind, is don't do it alone, right? So don't have the plan be, okay, call me whenever you're feeling suicidal and I'll be your lifeline. You don't want to be the only thing keeping this person afloat. It's bad for you and it's bad for them, right? You want to marshal all available resources. Help them identify someone in their life that they see outside of session, right? Because again, you're available an hour at a time, and maybe you take some call, but you're not. No one is realistically available all the time. Right? So someone that they see outside of session, out in the real world, that they can talk with about this, they're willing to share with that they're suicidal. Do give them the hotline number. That's 24/7. You never want to give them, oh, okay, feeling suicidal, here's the telephone number, have a good day. That is not sufficient, and that's malpractice. But give them that as one piece of the plan, yes. Talk with them about what things would prevent them from accessing these resources. So okay, you talk about this person, you got this phone number, if you're on call, you know my on-call number. Why wouldn't you, if you started feeling suicidal, why wouldn't you call this person, this number, or me? Right? And then problem solve around that. Right? So it's not enough to just give them resources. You need to check with them, okay, are you going to use these? What would keep you from using these? Okay, let's figure out how to get around those barriers to using these resources. Right? So it's a really involved process. And then along this kind of same idea of not doing it alone, for yourself, seek consultation or supervision, because this is a really stressful thing for therapists to deal with. And so sharing the burden a bit with other professionals. Everybody kind of expects to help out with help another therapist when they're dealing with this. So you're not going to be a burden to them. You expect to help other people with that, and you don't want to carry it all on your own because it is difficult. Okay, so don't do it alone. You may want to temporarily increase the frequency of sessions. Right, so if you're seeing them once a week, bump it up to twice a week, maybe more depending on the issues that are going on. And that's a clinical decision that's individualized depending on the problem and your relationship with this person. You want to ask for a commitment to try to work through this together. Right? So, how long can you put off making a final decision on killing yourself? Right? So, you're not really giving them something to fight against here, right? You're not saying, okay, you can't kill yourself, I'm not going to let you. Because we don't want to kind of activate some reactance. You say, okay, so you want to kill yourself, I respect your right to make that decision. How long can you put off that decision so we can work on some things, and then you can see if you still want to do it, right? So we're kind of taking that stance where we're not becoming adversarial. I'm going to work with you because I want you to be alive, but I respect it's your choice. But are you willing to work with me to see if maybe, if you're going to kill yourself, that's kind of a permanent solution. How long can you give me to figure out if there may be anything else that you could try before you go this permanent, irreversible route? So get that commitment. Okay, how long can you give me? 2 weeks, a month? What can it be? And challenge them and say, I don't know, 6 months, sure. Challenge them, really. You can honestly say 6 months. I want you to tell them the truth here, because there's no point in lying to me. Right? So make sure they give you kind of some realistic estimate of how long they can put off making a decision. And again, when they're telling you this, you're still assessing for risk, and you may change your mind from moderate to severe if you say, I can definitely give you, 12 hours. Okay, well, now I've just changed my mind maybe about this isn't moderate. We need to get you hospitalized. In terms of cognitive work, you might want to be doing. I talked before about that ambivalence. You want to attend to and make use of the ambivalence, right? You acknowledge and accept that some part of them wants to end the pain, maybe now, right? But another part of them clearly is fighting to live and hopes for things to be better. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in your office telling you about this. They didn't just come to say goodbye. Or if they fully wanted to do it and no part of them wanted to live, they would be dead right now. Right? But you acknowledge both parts. Right? And you talk about, okay, how can we keep that part of you that wants to live from getting taken out if the other part of you decides to act? Right? So you might act before you really made up your mind. So you're torn. But what if you're not thinking clearly, and that part of yourself that wants to die makes you take action? How can we stop that? And you can maybe use that to help get them to be a participant in developing a plan to reduce the risk of acting when they feel suicidal. So you acknowledge you're gonna feel this way, and there are reasons you feel this way. But how can we give that part of you that wants to live a chance to work through things? Right? So make them an active participant in this. So some cognitive work there. Behaviorally, there's some things obviously related to risk you want to do. Advise them to, for now, stay away from drugs or alcohol, because as we talked about before, the impulsivity. Ask them to remove access to lethal means. Okay, so you say you have a gun at home and you're not going to use it, but sometimes people make impulsive decisions regarding hurting themselves and they can't go back. Right now, when you're not feeling like killing yourself, would you agree to give that gun to your cousin, your neighbor, somebody else? Take it out of your house so that if you get into a dark mood, you won't go to it impulsively and make an irreversible decision. So if you can get them to agree to that, that would be great. Other things, work out with them how they can decrease the amount of time they're alone when it's bad. And for some people, it's bad at night, it's morning. Sometimes it's the weekend. Okay, well, let's problem solve around that, because being alone increases the risk. Have a friend stay over, go stay with family. do something to surround yourself with people that will be supportive for the times when you're at greater risk. And just in general, develop a plan for what they'll do when they do feel suicidal. When it gets bad, okay, well, what will you do to try to change your mood or your thoughts? Right? And have them come up with a list of things. Oh, I could try taking a bath. I could put on a funny movie. Usually playing with my cat helps. Whatever it is, get out a couple of things they could do, more than one. And one of those things probably should be somebody they can call. And if that person isn't home, who would you call? And if they aren't home, who would you call? Right? So get some backups. And then remind them, if you can't get a hold of anybody, you can always go to the ER and ask to be admitted. Right? And if you ask to be admitted, they're not going to lock you up forever. The hospital doesn't want you there for a long time. So if they have this fear about, if I go to the hospital, they'll lock me up in an institution and I'll never get out. No, not unless you have a fantastic insurance. It's not going to happen. But you can admit yourself, and frequently when you admit yourself, you decide when you go home. So talking about that, and then talking about, okay, when you need immediate help, who do you call? If they say, I call you, right? You say, call me second, but first, call 911, right? Call 911, that's the emergency number, and they will send somebody to come pick you up if you think you're going to hurt yourself now. One last thought on taking action on contracts, which I didn't mention contracts. I said earlier, strive to get an agreement to keep them seeing you. How long can you see me and can we work together? And document that you did this in your note. But doing a kind of an official do no harm contract, it's not clear in terms of kind of legal liability if that's a good idea. And the thinking goes, if you thought the risk was serious enough that they needed to sign this contract agreeing not to harm themselves, why didn't you get them admitted to a hospital? So I'm personally not real big on do no harm contracts. But what you should do in terms of your documentation is, in your note, discuss the process you use to determine risk. So ask the client this, and this. Looked at this, called this, whatever you did, write all that down. And then what the result of the assessment was, based on this, and this, I determined the risk was severe, moderate, minimal, whatever. And based on this level of risk, we decided to do this, and this. So what steps were taken based on that, the presumed risk. So if you document all that, you're doing the right thing ethically, legally, and also for your client, because those are the things you want to do. So we've talked about suicide as a result of crisis. It can also be the cause of crisis. So let's finish now by talking just a little bit about working with someone who's in crisis because someone else committed or maybe attempted suicide. Okay, so the things I want you to be thinking about, we'll talk about them in class, would be in terms of the perception of the event, what are the likely problematic cognitions you need to assess for? So if the parent and their child attempt suicide, what kind of things might a parent be thinking that wouldn't be helpful? Right? So the problematic cognitions, and what are the healthy cognitions? What's the right way to think about that in terms of psychological health? What's the healthy way of making sense of your child trying to kill him or herself? In terms of situational supports, what supports are available to people who aren't attempting suicide themselves? You kind of know what those are. But somebody who had a loved one attempt suicide or commit suicide, what's out there? And then in terms of coping behaviors, what kind of coping behaviors should you encourage, do you think would be helpful for this group dealing with this particular problem? Okay. So again, the question is kind of think about for class all that stuff about the model. Also, what role changes would you imagine would be the most likely result of crisis? What contexts for change in status would be most likely to result in crisis? How do you deal with that issue of responsibility versus self-blame when working with someone who's a survivor of rape? And then be prepared to do some suicide assessment work. All right, take care.